Hey there. If you have a scary story you'd like to hear on the channel, then go to mariesfield.com and send it my way. I'd love to feature it. And of course, thank you. I have a story that may not be scary or creepy, but it's one that should be heard and used as a cautionary tale to anyone out there that may be in a similar position or could be going down the wrong path. This story honestly could have happened anywhere, but at the time, I lived in the Kansas City area on the Kansas side. At the time, I was in my mid-20s and was with a man that was not mentally stable and was probably not in the best place myself, honestly. I had dropped out of college to be with this guy because he had given me the ultimatum. We had got an apartment together and I felt like I had to do what he wanted. Because of this, I was depressed and hitting a point where I didn't know what to do with my life. And this isn't me trying to net any pity from anyone. This is just me telling you all that I was on a downward trajectory and things were rough. At the time of this whole event, I was working at a big box store that you had to have a membership to get into. We'll call it Steve's Club. At the time, Steve's Club was known for paying decent wages in the area and not requiring much in ways of education, though they preferred you have a high school diploma. So a lot of the people that were my age and down on things would try to get into the job. My then boyfriend worked there as an overnight stock associate, and I worked there as a front end, basically ringing people up and then checking receipts if I was needed at the door. If anyone has ever worked retail, especially one of these kinds of stores, you'll know that it's very stressful and high demand. It may just be a retail job, sure, but you have to be fast and you have to take the brunt of the angry customers all day. Because of the levels of stress, it is nice when you befriend someone that is a coworker and can relate to them on a personal level. Sure, like I said, my boyfriend worked there, but he was overnight and I was days, so we never saw each other at work. So I was beyond excited when they hired a new daytime manager, and it happened to be a guy that I knew from high school and hadn't spoken to for a long time. For the sake of the story, I'll call him Jeff. Having him as my direct report was actually kind of neat because, like I said, he and I used to be friends, fell out for years, and here he was back in my life. Not only did I have a friend that was a coworker and could talk to, I had a friend that was my manager. Honestly, I thought this was going to be nice, to have someone I liked in a position above me, and I thought that I could potentially confide in him with any grievances I had about the job, and I had a friend I could spend time with, and we did. After he got started and got comfortable with the position, we started talking a lot more during our shifts and started getting lunch together, and we grew a lot closer. Now, like I said earlier, there is a lot of stress involved with the job, and the closer we got, I actually learned how Jeff was coping with the stress, and the easiest way to put it is that he was abusing substances. Well, unfortunately, the more I spent time with him, the more open he was about what he was doing, and that's where things started to really hit a low. I'm not going to really get into all of it. I don't want to spill all the details and tell everyone what exactly we were doing, but I ended up falling into the same spiral that he was falling into. I started joining him after work and doing the various things he was doing. I was going to lunch with him and abusing various substances and going back to work and trying to keep my composure while the various chemicals messed with my brain and made me feel like I was just floating through my shift. I hated it. I know that sounds counterproductive, but I genuinely hated what I was doing. I was destroying myself just to feel a bit less stressed. What was worse, I just could not seem to pull myself away from the situation. I kept going to lunch with Jeff. I kept spending time with him after work and before I went home, and I just kept using. Then there was one day after our shifts were over where things changed and I realized we were at rock bottom. Jeff asked if I would join him outside after I clocked off, and I of course agreed. We went out to his car, and I was expecting him to hand me something we'd done before, but then he pulled out a small piece of a rubber hose he had in his pocket. At first, I didn't get what he was doing. Then he told me to help him tie off his arm, and it hit me. Of course, I had no idea what to do in this situation, so I just did what he asked. I helped him tie it off. He then pulled a small case that looked like it would be for insulin or something from his center console, and, well, you can guess the rest. After he injected it, I watched as his face went from his normal smiling self to basically looking dead. His eyes rolled back, he stopped talking, and his mouth just fell wide open. This was the moment that it clicked how far down we had ended up. It almost felt like I was watching a movie, like what was happening in front of me was fake, and I was just part of an audience to it. I just sat there and stared at him, thinking that he didn't just shoot up, that he was joking or something and would say gotcha at any moment, but he didn't. He kind of just slumped over and, again, he looked dead. I had no idea what the hell I was supposed to do here. If I was supposed to do what he had just done, if I was there to make sure he didn't die, why did he put me in this situation? All I could think to do was start crying and then call an ambulance. I ran back into the store and I told someone up front that I needed them to call 911 immediately, and I informed him that Jeff was passed out in his car and they needed to get an ambulance to the store, and then ran back out to wait for the medics. Every second that ticked by, as I watched him just not moving, it was hitting me harder and harder that I was partially responsible for this. I was giving him affirmation for his addictions. Sure, he had dragged me into this world, but I was sticking around for it. I was joining him. I was adding a bit of positivity to the horrible things he was doing. This event is honestly what got me sober and away from that world. After all this happened, I looked into support groups. I got away from drug use and I cleaned up my life, which also included leaving my then boyfriend and moving back in with my parents for a bit. Jeff survived. He didn't overdose or anything. He ended up being put into treatment as well and could have faced charges with what they found in his car, but since he went in to get clean, he was able to avoid any consequences. I don't talk to him anymore, but he's still a friend on Facebook, so I know that he's doing better. I'm doing better as well, happily married, working in an office environment, and we're actually expecting our second child, and our first one is 4. So yeah, while this story may not be creepy to most people, I hope it does something for someone. I hope that I can help anyone out there in a similar situation to what I was get out of said situation and see that they deserve better than what they're going through. Don't ruin your life for that opportunity to get high. Don't destroy what you could have for what equates to a couple minutes of relief. My story takes place back in 2010, when I had just turned 19 and had finally gotten my own place away from my parents. Don't get me wrong, my parents were great and supportive of me staying with them while I went to college, but I really didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. and I wasn't even sure if I wanted to go back to school. Staying with them meant being pressured into going back frequently. That and the fact that my dad is a youth pastor, so he was also rather strict and nosy when it came to my personal life. So I was kind of counting the days until I was able to get out of there. I actually landed a decent call center job with a friend of mine that made pretty good money, and he was looking for a roommate, so he and I went in on a 2-bedroom apartment at a small property in my town. It was a decent area, across the street from an elementary school, and walking distance from a strip mall that had a Target and a movie theater. My point is that it was a pretty decent and family-oriented area that you wouldn't expect anything to happen in. When we got our lease papers signed and our deposits paid, the property manager wanted to take the time to walk around the property with us to show us the amenities, and they also wanted to introduce us to our neighbors. They said something about them valuing community, so introducing us to the people in our building was important to them. Most of the neighbors were decent people, a couple of older couples, a single mother with 2 kids. Then across the hallway was an older gentleman that we're going to call Dan. Dan was a bit of a weird guy when we were introduced. He was awkward when he answered, and the property manager told him who we were, but I kind of just thought that was who he was. Hell, I'm an awkward person myself, so I was able to sympathize with him. After all that was said and done, we started moving our stuff into our unit and sorting out our rooms, setting up the living room and all that. Then, about an hour or 2 into the whole thing, there was a knock on the door. I opened it up and it was Dan. He immediately asked if he could come in. At first I was a bit nervous about letting him in. I didn't really know him. But after a moment I figured, why not get to know him better? He walked in and immediately started apologizing for his behavior earlier. I told him it was fine and that it was awkward how they forced people to meet their neighbors anyway, so I would have been the same way. He then mentioned that he actually was bipolar schizophrenic, and while he usually had it under control, he'd been having issues lately because of problems with his medication, and he wanted to come over to let me know that he wasn't normally that kind of person. Now, my older brother was actually diagnosed with bipolar disorder, so I had some understanding how hard that could be. I told him about it, and he seemed almost relieved that I seemed to understand what he was going through. After a few moments of idle talking, he said he had to get back and headed back across the hall. Now, I have no issue with people that have mental disorders like he did. I was in a position where I could understand that it was hard, and I had seen my brother go through a lot of hard times as I was growing up. I kind of expected that having him across the hallway would not be a typical neighbor experience, and that was fine with me. I, however, did not expect how things would go. About a month into us living there, I came home from work and I saw Dan standing outside his apartment just staring at his door. It was a bit weird, but I figured it was probably just an episode, and I thought maybe I could pull him back if I approached him carefully and spoke with him. I said his name once or twice, and he kind of reacted, but just kept staring. I asked him if he was okay, and he kind of turned toward me saying really softly, "He locked me out. He told me I have to stay out here until he lets me in." Thankfully, because of my brother's issues, I had some knowledge on how to approach someone in this situation. Stay calm and quiet, don't touch the person, ask them to sit down, and remember that you can't always reason with them. With all that in mind, I calmly asked him if he was feeling okay, or if he was feeling scared or angry, just trying to get a feel of what he was going through. He told me that he was mad, but he understood why he did it. He mentioned that he had a bad day and did something wrong, so he had to stay outside until he learned his lesson. I nodded slightly and told him it would be okay, and asked him if he would like to have a seat while he waited. At first, he kind of looked a bit confused, but I told him that I could bring out a chair so he didn't have to stand, because I knew standing could get uncomfortable. That kind of got through to him, and he said he would like a chair. I went into the apartment and got him one, and then asked him if he wanted me to stay with him until he was allowed back in. He smiled at me, which I felt was a good sign, but then said that I wasn't in trouble like he was, so I should go back inside. I told him that I would if that's what he wanted, and mentioned that if he needed someone to sit out there with him, he could knock on the door and I would be there for him. It seemed to help some, but again, I knew he was in a bit of a different world in his head, so I wasn't going to pressure him. After going inside, I texted my roommate and mentioned that Dan was having an episode, and that if he was still out there when he got home, to approach him slowly and not make too much small talk. After he got home, he told me that Dan was still sitting out there and staring at the door, and asked how long he'd been there. I only knew that he'd been there for around 20 minutes or so, but it was likely more. We left it at that for about an hour, but then around midnight, there was a knock on the door. It was Dan. He asked me if I could come outside and talk to him for a moment. I agreed and stepped out. I asked if he was okay, and he started crying as soon as I asked. I wasn't sure if he was still in an episode or if he had come out of it, so I slowly reached my hand out and asked him if he was okay or if he needed me to call someone for help. I did not expect what he said next. He told me that I needed to call the cops because he had hurt his girlfriend. The whole time he's saying this, he's sobbing and staring at the floor. I realized that he was, at this point, more lucid than he was earlier, and I asked him what happened. He told me that they got into an argument about something and that he didn't remember what he did, but he knew she was in there and that she was hurt. I asked him if that was why he felt like he needed to sit in the hallway, and he nodded. He then asked me if I would go into the apartment with him to check on her because he was scared to go alone. I said I would in just a moment, then went and got my roommate to stand in the doorway just in case he wasn't all there yet. I told him that Dan needed me to go with him to check on his girlfriend and that I wanted him to stand there just in case anything happened. We went into the apartment and it was a mess. There were dishes broken all over the floor. The living room was trashed, and it was pretty obvious that there had been a struggle, and it was violent. I asked Dan if he knew where she was, and he said she was in the bathroom the last time he saw her. I asked him if he would sit in the chair while I went to check because I wanted him to stay calm. He agreed and went to sit down while I walked down the hallway to the bathroom. What I saw was about as bad as I expected. This young woman was lying naked on the floor of the bathroom. There was blood all over the floor in the shower, and the room was completely destroyed. My initial thought was that he had killed her, but as soon as I walked into the room, I started hearing her groan slightly. To my surprise, she was alive, but barely. I called my roommate and told him to call 911 and to tell them that there was a badly injured woman in the unit, then knelt down to try to talk to her. I asked her if she could hear me. She whispered yes and asked for help. I didn't know what all had happened and told her not to move just in case she had a head or neck injury, and I told her that help was on the way. I asked her if she knew what happened, and she mumbled incoherently, but kind of just faded in and out. I told her I would be right back and that the ambulance would be here in just a few moments and to hold on. I went back into the living room to check on Dan, and he was still sitting in the chair, crying his eyes out. I was obviously concerned because of the situation, but I figured it was best to try to talk to him and try to explain to the medics and police when they got there that Dan had some issues. I talked to him for a few moments, but wasn't able to get much information out of him about what happened, and then the medics came to check out the situation. I spoke to the police when they showed up and told them that Dan had schizophrenia and that he said he hurt her, but I didn't know what had really happened. They took over from there and I went back over to my apartment. I didn't sleep that night, to be honest. A couple weeks later, I had learned what had really happened, and it wasn't what I anticipated either. Dan had actually not hurt her. She had slipped in the shower and Dan heard her fall. When he went into the room and saw her on the floor, he had apparently panicked. He knew that he needed to call for help, but his mind basically told him that he needed to panic. He really wanted to do what he was supposed to, but his brain was not able to process that he needed to dial 911, and it got worse because he started telling himself that he had done it. My guess is that he left the apartment to get someone else, but may have immediately forgotten what he set out to do, so he was just staring at the door trying to remember. Then I got home and that's where things went from there. I actually learned all this from her when she came home and she introduced herself. She didn't live there, she was just staying for a few days here and there to make sure he was okay because he was having issues with his medication. She told me that the only thing she remembered was slipping and then me standing over her telling her help was on the way. I was thankful that Dan hadn't actually hurt her, but it was obvious that he needed more help than he was getting. He actually did get back on track with his meds, and the next time I saw him, he hugged me and thanked me for helping him. I told him it wasn't that big of a deal, but he was adamant that I had pretty much saved her life, and that me talking to him the way I had was what likely got him back to reality. I lived there for a few years after that with my roommate, but we ended up moving out around 2015. Dan lived there with his girlfriend the whole time, and he never had another major episode like that day. After that, he was the friendliest neighbor I ever had and would always greet us with a bright smile. So, Dan, wherever you are out there, I hope you're doing well, and I would love it if we met again someday. I have a story from when I went to college back in the mid-90s. What happened didn't actually happen to me, but the person that was my roommate at the dorm, and it's the reason she actually moved onto campus and started living in the dorms. Obviously, I'm not giving out the name of the school or my city. I'll just say we were in the southwest section of the US and leave it there. I lived on campus for most of my time in classes, but the school had it set up to where you didn't have to live on campus at all, and a lot of people took advantage of that, living with family, each other, etc. My friend, eventually roommate, and the person this story is about, was a short gal named Stacy. Stacy is one of those girls that just never really grew taller than she was in middle school, and she had a very small frame at the time. She was often taken for being weak, or thought to be a teenager pretending to be an adult. That said, when I got to know Stacy, I learned that she was a bit of a firecracker, and she took a number of self-defense courses, so she knew how to properly defend herself if she ever needed to. After a while of living with me at the dorm, she told me about her previous roommate and what happened to get her to move onto campus. Whenever she was starting her first semester, she didn't want to live on campus because of the additional cost to the tuition, so she went pretty heavy into wanted ads. This was the mid-90s, like 96 if I remember correctly, so the internet wasn't really an option. She said that she met with a handful of people in the weeks leading up to her first week, and she was getting worried because none of the places that she looked at seemed to be worth paying for. She said that she was complaining about it to her mom over dinner when her mom had made a comment about having a coworker who had a son the same age that was attending the same school. She mentioned that she was pretty sure he had his own place and that the coworker was just funding it for him, so she said that she would talk to her and get more information about him so that it could be an option. She was a bit desperate, so even though she had never met the guy, she was willing to at least consider it as a possibility. She ended up meeting with the son, who we'll call AJ, and he seemed like he was an okay guy, plus he lived in a 2-bedroom unit and didn't have use for the second bedroom beyond storing his extra stuff. They had pretty much agreed that she would take the spare room as long as she furnished it, and his parents would just keep paying the rent as long as she pitched in for food. Basically, she had gotten in on a pretty sweet deal that seemed like it was going to work great. She said that the whole thing was fine at first, and that the guy would basically keep to himself with little interaction. She was working part-time and was attending classes full-time, so they didn't really interact much. For the first month, nothing really happened. AJ was friendly when they saw each other, but about a month in, he seemed like he was being more and more forward with the conversations. It wasn't too creepy, but he was very intense on getting to know her better, asking if she had a boyfriend, asking her about what she was studying, what she wanted to do in life, etc. She thought he was just trying to get to know her better, which wasn't a huge deal, but he kept asking things which, to her, was feeling a bit intrusive. She attempted to set some boundaries with him, basically saying that she appreciated him trying to get to know her, but that she did kind of prefer that he not pry so much into her personal life. Having known Stacy as long as I have, I can say that she can be a bit direct at times. She's very to the point with how and what she says, but not necessarily rude, just very straightforward in her presentation. She said that AJ seemed to understand what she was saying and was a respectful conversation, but that it only got worse. For a few days, AJ seemed to be upset with her, but then he went back to being himself, including going back to asking personal questions. At this point, Stacy started to just give short or incorrect answers because at this point it was obvious he wasn't going to quit. It was annoying, but it wasn't enough for her to give up her living arrangement. That is, until about a week later. During one of the days where Stacy was off work and didn't have class, AJ was out of the apartment doing something else during the day. Stacy decided to do some cleaning around the apartment and putting things away. She grabbed his backpack and went to put it back in his room so it was out of the way. She opened his door and went to put it on his bed when she glanced over and noticed that there was a pair of women's underwear sitting on his nightstand. She said that at first she thought it was his girlfriend's or something, until after a few moments it clicked and she realized that it was actually one of hers. Obviously, she was a bit grossed out by the situation. It wasn't in a place where it could have accidentally come in with the laundry or something like that. It was on the nightstand next to his bed. At this point, she was pretty fed up with everything. Him being nosy about everything, being inappropriate, and now this was enough to get her to decide to find a new place to live. It didn't quite end there though. When AJ got home, Stacy said that she confronted him about the underwear that she found in his room, and the entire thing unfurled into something insane. She said that he told her he took it because he needed to know what size she was, and that he had more of her clothing in his room for that exact reason. He said that he was going to give them back here soon, but that he had a surprise for her, which was the reason he needed to know her sizes. He walked back to his room, and when he came back, he was holding what looked like a wedding dress. And then he got on his knees and asked Stacy if she would, in his words, honor him by becoming the woman he would spend the rest of his life with. Obviously, she said no, and immediately started looking into getting a new place to live. She said that she no longer felt comfortable being anywhere near him, and that for the couple weeks that she lived there, after that, she would sleep with her door blocked by her end table just in case. Apparently, after this event, he stopped speaking to her altogether and was rarely home. She packed her stuff up and got a hold of the campus to move into the dorms, and then became my roommate. She was shocked that he was that level of obsessed with her, to the point that he went and bought a dress for her after stealing her clothes and all that. And while some people may hear this and think that's not that creepy, in my opinion, I completely agree with Stacy. This was creepy as hell. If he was just into her and took it slow, it would be one thing, and he would have found out that Stacy wasn't exactly straight. Instead, he went the route of being weird and obsessive, taking her clothes to get her size, and then spending money on a wedding dress to propose to someone that he had only known for about 2 months. Obviously, not the best way to go about it. Stacy got out of there as quickly as she could and never talked to him again after that. So that, my friends, was another scary story collection. Got creepy stories about creepy people and just scary situations to be in. That's not okay. So thank you to those that submitted those stories. And if you did enjoy this video, please do give it a like below. And if you'd like to hear more content like this, go ahead and subscribe as well if you haven't already. There's plenty of room for you here. And lastly, don't forget to leave a comment on your thoughts or let me know. It's getting warmer here, so I guess it's spring now. Do you have any plans for spring? Do you take a spring break? I don't know. And with that being said, friends, I'm going to go have dinner. So I hope you have a fantastic week. And until next time, take care.